Now, the next presentation is actually a rebroadcast of a meeting from 2021 we had on redlining, which is something that was started during the 30s, during the FDR administration, okay? And it was basically to segregate certain communities from other communities, the opposite of what we were just talking about in terms of creating community. So I'd like to bring this on, and after this, we will be joined by two others, myself, Braden Crooks, who's doing the presentation, and Bishop Mitchell Taylor, and also Memo Salazar from the Community Land Trust, who discussed ways forward. Okay, so I know it's a somewhat long night, but stick around. You'll find it's really interesting. The time goes quick. So Victor, if you could start the presentation, I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, now for the main event, we're very, very pleased to have a presentation again, like I've been saying, on redlining, and the presenter will be Braden Crooks. Braden is a founding partner of Designing the We, a social impact design studio operating in community-driven social and economic development. The DWE team designs programs, policies, and enterprises that grow local communities and global networks dealing with deep crisis, from the history of redlining to the future of work. He's on the board of the New York State Sustainable Business Council and has served as the president of the board of Sure We Can, a nonprofit collective for canners, who are those who make their living by redeeming cans and bottles for 5 cents. Braden graduated from the innovative MS Design program and urban ecologies at Parsons at the New School for Design in May of 2014 with honors, taught ecological thinking and urban issues at Parsons, and produced live audience webinars about New York, and he's an RSA fellow. He received his undergraduate from Pennsylvania State University for landscape architecture. In Pennsylvania, he founded Groundswell PA, a community and environmental rights initiative, which campaigned for and passed a community environmental bill of rights in the borough of State College, Pennsylvania, by a popular vote in November of 2011. This is the first instance of rights of nature passed in the United States by using a popular vote. Groundswell helped pass a second initiative on Ferguson Township, Pennsylvania in 2012, November. Braden lives and gardens in Brooklyn, New York. Braden, please join us. We're very happy to have you.
Thanks, Richard, for that very thorough introduction. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm really glad to be able to walk you all through part of our Undesign the Redline exhibit on a virtual tour. And I can just get started if that sounds good. So let me, as Richard said, I'm part of Designing the We, which is a design studio, and we created this exhibit. Actually, we launched in the Bronx in 2015, and along with April DeSimone, who's the other co-founder of Designing the We, and shout out to her. She's from the Bronx, and we, I'll mention the Bronx again in our presentation, but yeah, since then it's gone all around the country. We've had several exhibits in the city. Obviously, since COVID, we've been doing mostly virtual presentations, and I'm glad to be able to do that with you all. And we'll look through kind of the history of redlining specifically, but really how it connects to structural racism and inequality in cities in general, and really leads up until today in many ways. And I'm going to be giving kind of a partial presentation, but I'll drop the link to our website where we have the full exhibit actually in a virtual reality format, which is pretty cool, and videos and stuff like that as well. So I'll do that at the end. But I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me here as I do this. and I can get the presentation started. And Richard, just tell me if you can't see this.
Looks good. You can see it.
Awesome.
Mhm.
So let's just get right into it.
I wonder one question, Victor, before I start, can we expand that all? Because some of it is it possible to make a fuller screen of it? Because some of the typing is small.
No, it's already in full screen.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
I can make it the full image, but it won't
Yeah.
show
Why don't you do
guys.
that?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Mhm.
Sounds good. So just get right into it. You know, here you actually see there in the middle. This is the first section of our exhibit. That's a redlining map of the Bronx. I actually pulled up while we were early just now Astoria, so we'll be able to look at that in a minute. But you know, redlining maps. Zooming in here, these are issued in the 1930s. So this is actually part of the New Deal, and so this federal government, right, is responding to the Great Depression. We have, you know, also a foreclosure crisis in that era. And the federal government says, you know, we need to step in and refinance mortgages and get involved in the home ownership and home mortgage market, prop that up, basically. And so they're going to they're going to start, you know, they create the 30-year and 15-year mortgage, right? If you're, you know, homeowner, you're probably familiar with that. They're going to be federally insuring home loans, right? They kind of actually really invent the American dream of owning your own home with these policies, because beforehand, if I was, you know, going to buy a house, I might put half my money down or even all my money down, get a 5-year mortgage. This is really going to open up home ownership. But, okay, it's the 1930s, right? So the federal government is actually really explicitly racist, explicitly white supremacist, and they're going to want to bake into all these system structures they're creating, not just home mortgages, ways to cut people of color out of benefiting from them. And redlining is really one of the most consequential. And the way they do that is with the maps. And so the maps are essentially a risk assessment scheme, right? So they start issuing these home loans, and they realize, you know, wait a minute, where you really don't have one universal system to assess risk. So beforehand, if I was, or you were going to get a loan, right, you would go to your banker. Maybe you already have an existing relationship, right? Or they would assess your credit in a relational way. Well, now we're, you know, this is before you and I would have a credit score, right? But instead what they decide to say, let's give everybody's neighborhood a credit score. And that's basically what redlining is. And there's only 4, right? So there you can see there, if you're familiar with the northernmost part of the Bronx, right, you got Riverdale and Fieldston there, right, in green, which is best, right? A green light, definitely lend here. This is an area where we want to see credit flow. Blue, which is second best, right? Pretty good. Yellow, which is sometimes called declining. And then finally red, which are referred to as hazardous areas. And, you know, go down here to the South Bronx, where April grew up, right? You get huge swaths of red and yellow, which isn't much better. And, you know, these areas are really going to be cut off from availability of this type of credit. But the thing is that because this is issued by the federal government, it's backed, you know, it goes to 239 different maps. So all the cities and basically around the whole country. And, you know, it's going to be feeding into banking practices and discrimination, things like that, that are already, you know, that groundwork is already laid. And it's going to bleed out. So it's not just going to land on home mortgages and these federally backed loans, but bank branch locations, business loans, insurance rates, basically all type of credit and really access to the money system gets cut off and strangled in these neighborhoods. And this really changes these neighborhoods, because when they're redlined, there really aren't blighted, empty, abandoned, terrible places, right? Actually, no. That you would, places you might think, oh, these would be, they'd use the word hazardous, right? No, these are full neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods with storefronts and people, and small businesses. These might not be the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city, but they're far from areas that you would think of as hazardous if you were to use that language at all. And so, that becomes that these areas, because they're cut off of availability of these resources, enter a cycle of decline and disinvestment, right? So it's harder to buy and sell a home, so property values decline. It's harder to start a business, so businesses shutter. And these areas enter cycles of disinvestment that will eventually lead to abandoned buildings, the fires, right, and throughout New York in the 70s and 80s, the massive trauma and toll that takes on the social fabric of these neighborhoods, which is tremendous and leads to further crisis, which we'll talk about a little bit, right? It leads to epidemics, it leads to addiction, it leads to, frayed social fabric and violence and crime and things like this. And this is set in motion by deliberate federal policy. And you ask yourself, well, why zone an area red, right? Why do this to a neighborhood? Well, the answer is in the maps. And if you go to what are called the area descriptions, these tell you, these are really the smoking gun. They tell you, why is it red, or why is it yellow, or why is it blue, right? And you go down to line C there, it says detrimental influences. This is for an area in the Bronx. Detrimental influences, Negro infiltration, right? So there's no mincing of words, right? The federal government comes out and says, there are hazardous racial and social groups in America. And we need to know where they are and where they're quote unquote infiltrating, or sometimes they use the word invading. And those places are going to become synonymous with decline and disinvestment. And so, in this era, right, you see the full racial hierarchy established, right? You have a particular targeting of quote unquote Negro infiltration, but then you also have all different groups, deemed as various hazardous people, right? So you have obviously Hispanic Americans, Asian families, right? At this point in time, new immigrant groups that they refer to here as foreign born, right? Which included Italian immigrants, Eastern European, Greek, Jewish people, right? All of whom are in some way or another referred to at this point in time in the 1930s as not white. And you zoom over here, right? They even have a special line D, that denotes the percentage of Negro infiltration. And in this case, right, it's 3%. So it's a sort of one drop rule, essentially, but for a neighborhood. And this is a big change because beforehand, if you were a Black family, you might have trouble yourself getting a loan from one of these banks, right? But now so will all your white neighbors, because you happen to live on the block, right? You're an infiltrator, and this means it's redlined. So now this is going to spur white flight out of those neighborhoods as white folks flee those areas to get mortgages and the GI Bill and right all the things that are going to go on in suburbia. And that 3% becomes 97%. And segregation, which had been increasing, accelerates. So actually, if you dial back, several decades before even the 1930s, segregation was not predominantly the number one way that racial apartheid in America was enforced. But eventually it becomes more and more segregated. And so you get, even up until the 70s and 80s, it gets worse to what's called hyper-segregation, where we concentrate people into redline neighborhoods at the same time that we're disinvesting and devaluing those neighborhoods. Right? And that is going to be, even though, it's gotten slightly better, it hasn't really. As you may know, New York City, still today, is the fourth most segregated city in America. And so, this is really written in black and white, right? As this says, right? There's no mincing of words. And while on the one hand, as I'm saying here, right, you concentrate one group into redlined areas, disinvest those areas. On the other hand, you have this huge spigot of wealth building, which is going to be for home ownership, right? You have the coming of, the explosion of American suburbia, the building out of that whole landscape, right? But that is going to be mostly for white families. And one of the things that they're going to say in these maps is that they are looking for what, in terms of making an area green, they are looking for areas that have restrictions on hazardous infiltration, which means a neighborhood covenant that says this is a whites only neighborhood, or it's in the deed of the house to say you can't sell this house to a black family or an Asian family, etc. And that means that's good. That's what we want to see, because by preserving racial homogeneity, you're going to preserve property values. And that's the argument made by the federal government. Now, mind you, there was no evidence that they cited for that. There's no evidence that property values were any less because the neighborhoods were integrated. And in fact, the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago did a really great study not very long ago showing that integrated neighborhoods tended to have slightly higher property values at this era, right? But this, nonetheless, despite the fact that this is just invented, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And now that the federal government has created a system for it, it becomes self-fulfilling, because now you're not going to be able to get that mortgage. You're not going to be able to sell a house, start a business, right? So that the race, property value, investment, money all gets intertwined. And you fast forward till today, right? And we know that the structural situation created by these programs, even though redlining is made illegal, even though, right, we still, mind you, have lawsuits for redlining in New York State, a dozen a year or so, right? Right, it's made illegal. Certainly the federal system is made illegal, and then it's made illegal later in the banking system, which I'll mention in a minute. But that structural situation that this creates is still the same, right? And the two major outputs are that geography, right? Which we see in cities across the whole country, right? Concentrated areas of poverty, mostly people of color in cities, and much whiter, much wealthier suburbs that surround them. And now, of course, we're seeing the merry-go-round go around again, right? And new waves of displacement, I'll mention in a second, as investment pours back into redline neighborhoods. But the other major impact has been wealth and the racial wealth gap, right? Because what's the number one mechanism of wealth building in the US? It's been home ownership, certainly in the past several decades, and property ownership, from land and businesses to owning people, right, for American history. So not only are we going to cut out people's ability to build wealth through home ownership, but those who did own, right, are not going to see that home after redlining, right, in the decades after redlining, become an asset, right, that they build wealth. No, they go underwater, you lose your money, foreclose, et cetera, right? And so, we've seen the racial wealth gap actually grow in the past decade, especially after the foreclosure crisis, when predatory practices, right, get concentrated once again in redline neighborhoods. And so here you start to look at New York City and the area in general. One thing I want to mention, right, as I'm thinking about it right now, if you do have a few technical questions or clarifying questions for me, please throw them in the chat. Before we transition to the panel, I can hit on a couple of those if there are any. We can obviously just hit them in the panel too, but just in case you have any questions. And put them in the comments, I mean to say. So right here, you start to see just how much New York City is redlined, the difference between areas like Westchester or further out on Long Island, areas of Bergen County in New Jersey, right? But huge swaths of New York City get redlined. And one of the things I'll just point out that you often see, and you can, I will share a link where you can to a site called Mapping Inequality, and they've done a great job digitizing all these maps, and you can check them out more there. But one thing you'll see is neighborhoods, right, redline neighborhoods tend to be in one of two situations. One is still locked in disinvestment, still very much so in the situation redlining created, or two, kind of speculated on, flipped, essentially gentrified, right? And if you, it's hard to see, I can't zoom in on this, but you'll notice, for example, Tribeca is red on this. Well, Tribeca is not red today, but one thing you'll notice, right, the folks who live there and the people who redlined are no longer there. So what is our question is always, as an organization, what's the third way, right? How does investment come into a neighborhood that really starts to heal the wealth destruction of redlining? How does the tide, we want the tide to rise, right? But how does it rise everybody's boats rather than washing folks away? And that's where we start to think about systems change and design, which is some of the work that we do, which is going to take bigger policy, and from bigger policy all the way down to community-based projects. But I do want to zoom in to show you, because I figured people would want to see. This is, again, still from the Mapping Inequality site. You'll notice, right, all red through huge parts of Astoria, and yellow, which really isn't that much better, although it's somewhat better. And this is the area description for D3, I believe, D3 or D4. But you'll start to see some of the languages used locally. You get down to section 2 there, inhabitants. Line C is foreign-born families. It's got Italian and Greek. And then they do have, right, Negro, yes, at 2%, right? So they're very concerned about this. This is, this is going to become a big piece of the justification. They also mention things like industry. They mention, commercial waterfront, et cetera. And those are considerations. But one thing you will find is that if a neighborhood, has those qualities, but then doesn't have this quote unquote infiltration, you'll never find it in red. You might find it in yellow or something like that. But the predominant racial elements are still there. So, this, mind you, these are the maps. The maps are issued in 37 and 38. These are issued one time. But they also issue the underwriting manual. And this becomes, some people think, even more significant because it lasts longer. And this is going to go to banks and underwriters, and it's asked them to look out for whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present, to the end that intelligent prediction may be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups, right? So, unfortunately familiar language for, our era, but this is very much so going to be infiltrating this mentality and the systems of banking, real estate. Now, mind you, this is how the federal government is talking about this, right? These are the people that we, have entrusted, to steward our democracy. Well, what about the private real estate industry? How are they going to talk about it? Well, here we have the next slide is going to be this clip this is from a real estate textbook that dates back as early as 1910. So, right, this is some of the thinking that's going to inform the federal policy. And this says, the colored people certainly have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but they must recognize the economic disturbance which their presence in a white neighborhood causes, and forgo their desire to split off from the established district where the rest of their race lives. They refer to that as the property value argument, right? Because if you're a good realtor, you protect the property values of your clients, right? And this is how. And mind you, this is in the textbook, so this would be on your test if you were going to become a realtor. But, this is the type of language that by the 1968 Fair Housing Act is going to be made illegal, but it's still very much so, and we know this, embedded in much of real estate. Particularly, you see, for example, if you've heard of the recent investigative journalism and lawsuits going on Long Island for steering and all kinds of things, segregation that's ongoing out there in Nassau County. So, the good thing is I have some time, so I'm able to kind of spend a little bit more time on this. So this is our timeline. If you see this exhibit in person, which I encourage you to do once you're vaccinated, once things get back to normal, it's 14 feet long. So, there's a lot on here. You can see redlining there in red, kind of towards the middle left, right? And there's a lot, and the reason we have this is because there's a lot that precedes redlining and that informs it, and there's a lot that comes after. Redlining is not the only thing and the only policy, right, that happens. But one of the things that we know is that in each successive era, oftentimes the proposed quote unquote solutions of one era become the crises of the next era, right? And you'll see that through this history. But also that this transition that redlining embodies, it's one of the reasons why we think redlining is so important to understand, is because it really embodies this transition that occurred from very explicit Jim Crow era racism, where you can read it in black and white, right, where it says hazardous infiltrators, and then designs that into structural racism, right, where it's designed into the geographic structure, it's designed into wealth, it's designed into all these systems, right, even though that explicit language gets removed, right, because you fast forward to today, right, and because of this geography and because of all the inequality that this creates, right, you can have different different schools, you can have different housing, certainly different healthcare and health outcomes, right? And that talk about zip code, right? Some people point out, for example, that the number one determinant of your life expectancy is your zip code, okay? And that's because of systems like this. Environmental justice issues, this industry siting of things like that, urban renewal, which will bring highways and things like that, often through red line neighborhoods, access to healthcare, right? So all of these things, right, we talk about as separate crises, are very much so entangled in the same history, and we haven't undesigned it. And I think that that's obviously that's the title of the exhibit, and right, it hasn't been undone. It's not enough to say, yeah, we're going to stop doing harm. We're going to stop redlining, right? You actually have to say, well, we have to undo the legacies that it created, or we're going to just keep reproducing the same outcomes again and again. So I'm going to zoom through this kind of quickly in the last 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Right? If you zoom back to before redlining, we have obviously we began this in kind of right after the end of the Civil War. You could go much, much further back. You have First Nations displacement and genocide being really, obviously, America's first kind of play on land. One thing that I'll point out here, I guess I can't zoom in on it, but there's this painting down there. It might be a little hard to see, but it's called American Progress. And it's this image of the American plains. And on the far right side is the sun is rising, and you have New York City, and then you have the trains coming across and frontiersmen. And then on the left side of the image, the darkness is leaving the land, along with, the American Indians fleeing the edge of the image. And the goddess of progress is in the middle carrying a school book, interestingly. Mm-hmm. And, what is this painting talking about? Well, it's talking about manifest destiny, but it's really talking about, well, why take the land, right? Why should the land belong to white settlers and not to the indigenous folks who live there? Well, the answer is, and the answer that this painting is trying to portray is that Native Americans are wasting the land, right? They're not using it to its highest and best use. They're not making the most productivity out of the land and profitability out of the land. And land should belong to whomever can make the most productivity and profitability. And this is a really critical idea of land use that comes out of this legacy, right? Because we're asking ourselves a really critical question, which is, to whom does land belong? And the answer could be, land belongs to whomever lives there. But instead, we're going to say, right, it's going to be about profitability and productivity, right? So that you can follow through, and the question, of course, goes back to what we mentioned earlier with how does investment come into a red line neighborhood, and does it, and how do we make sure, and it's a policy question, but also a systems question, that that wealth starts to spread and build for everybody, right? We don't really have those systems yet, in large part, mainly because people got cut out of home ownership. But anyway, so you follow this, you follow these threads, right? And so you have, I'd like to, we like to mention we have at the end of the Civil War, we have a period of Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was this brief window where we really could have charted a different direction. You have the first African-American elected officials to Congress, large-scale enfranchisement, the seeds of Black wealth building that will become, a national Black banking industry, which, by the way, also gets wiped out through the Great Depression and redlining, largely, but also things like Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But that all closes. That window closes, and in its wake, you get Jim Crow, Black codes, you get waves of violence, the KKK, racial terror, right? And that spurs the Great Migration, and it feeds ideas of segregation into systems like redlining. You get scientific racism, right? Eugenics, white supremacy, pseudoscience, right? Saying that incubates it. That's not just a small thing. That's at Harvard and Princeton, right? That is a major intellectual movement in the United States, right? So all of this feeds into the production of massive systems. Systems of discrimination, of disenfranchisement, etc., that eventually are developed. Essentially, if you read Jim Crow or the documentary 13th, right, essentially try and reinstate slavery in some ways. Certainly, Black codes do that by using the convict leasing system, which you may be familiar with, right, which uses convict labor. To put folks right back onto the same plantations that they were freed from, making all kinds of behavior illegal, right? Loitering, unemployment, and making all this illegal, swooping people up into the convict leasing system, right? So this becomes these systems that even today you could find legacies of. We touch on, and I don't have time for it today, but we touch a lot of the movements that are pushing back on this. And I just want to say, in no time in this timeline are folks taking this lying down, right? And that big pushback has always been there and is obviously there today. And so, there's a whole history to tell for that. But right, so this is going to lead us into redlining, right? Jim Crow mentality gets fed into the New Deal. Redlining is going to produce things like blockbusting, white flight, eventually urban renewal, right? With just to zoom back with blockbusting, right? You'll have real estate speculators go into white neighborhoods, flip a house to a Black family, go around, knock on everyone's doors, call them 3 or 4 times a day, say, hey, Black folks are moving in. This means your housing property value is going to, collapse. So you can sell to me at a loss, or I'll come back next week, offer you 20% less, and so they'll buy the house from a white family for, let's say, $1,000, sell it to a Black family for $3,000, right? Triple their money, but then because they don't have access to these federally backed home loans, right, they're going to be using what's called contract buys and other predatory schemes, right, that are only, set up to extract wealth from people. This is a newspaper article from Saturday Evening Post. It says, would you panic if a Negro moved next door? It said, quote, I'm broad-minded, said one homeowner when Negroes moved onto his block. But a short time later, he panicked and sold his house at a loss. In this week's post, you read how speculators decide which blocks are, quote, ripe for racial change, how they use vicious tactics to force out the whites, and how one speculator brags he could, quote, bust your block in no time at all. In some ways, you can flip some of these words and get to some of the predatory practices you'll read about in gentrifying neighborhoods today that go on. And so this leads into an era of, urban renewal, which I mentioned earlier, right? You get slum clearance. They'll say things like, slums are a cancer on the city, right? So what do you have to do? Bulldoze them. And they'll replace something with things like public housing, right? Institutions and stadiums, highways, right? When public housing's first created, it's segregated. It's just for white families, most of it. And thought of as a big step up. The private real estate industry sues the federal government to say, hey, by providing public housing for white families, and it was mixed income, you're competing with private real estate, so please cease and desist, right? And so the federal government says, okay, we're just going to make it for very low income folks, and it's going to be integrated, but they never fill a funding gap that creates in the whole system, right? And so public housing, even though when it's first created, again, segregated, mostly for just for white families, right, becomes a new area of disinvested housing. And that is a pattern, right, that you'll see over and over again. This, then because of redlining, right, you get the tax base leaving cities, blue-collar and manufacturing jobs leaving cities, right? And then you get this era of quote-unquote urban decay, right? You see, when New York City almost went bankrupt, right? Lost all this money because there's no money left. And then you get policies like planned shrinkage come out of that. And so in planned shrinkage, you get the city says, look, we don't have enough money for the whole city anymore, right? So we're going to save our money for areas of the city that are quote unquote healthy and cut off and sacrifice neighborhoods that are quote unquote dying, right? So guess what? It's redline neighborhoods. And places like the South Bronx, places like, redline neighborhoods all over, Brooklyn, it's Queens, right? You have the cutting off of trash pickup, street maintenance, schools, libraries, parks. And the very first thing to get cut, it's actually a smart cities program. It's an algorithm. It's the very first smart cities program in New York City, is to cut fire departments.
Oh, that's true.
And every neighborhood, right, that they do this in is going to burn, right? And here come the fires, right? And now you have parts of the city, like certain census tracts, for example, in the South Bronx, where 80% of the built environment burns to the ground in a period of about 10 or 15 years. Right? So you physically destroy the city. So do you think that you can take all this disinvestment of financial disinvestment, layer on disinvestment of city resources, right? And concentrate folks still into these neighborhoods and then expect what, everybody's going to be okay? Right? So here comes now all the social crises that erupt out of this, particularly, you get epidemics, you get a heroin epidemic, right? Well, we're in the opioid epidemic today, right? You hear that a lot, talking about that as a public health crisis. Well, not so, right? And this becomes, we're not going to talk about healing, right? And this is a critical moment when we could go in different directions. We say, wow, look how disinvested, how much trauma, how much craziness is going on. We really need to heal and we really need to repair. But instead we get, actually the only solution we're going to approach this with is cracking down. And you get, that being the one tool in the toolbox when we needed many, many other tools. And you get the HIV/AIDS epidemic, right? It hits the same neighborhoods. A crack epidemic. There's an excellent documentary about that on Netflix that just came out. A violence epidemic. You absolutely get just tremendous amount of violence connected to the drug epidemics, right? That terrorizes many neighborhoods. And so that leads to, you had churches, right, and community centers, right, that they'd unravel. Families that are displaced, you get, massive evictions, fires, right, obviously bump people out. And this really, really takes a toll that we haven't accounted for. And again, right, this leads us, right up. One thing to say, okay, I should mention here, there's a big pushback in this era of community organizing Actually, starting really with the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, who do clean sweep days to clean up the trash the city's not cleaning up. They do free school lunches. They do a lot of, they kind of invent community organizing, a lot of what we think of it today. You also get people pushing for the Community Reinvestment Act, which passes in the 1970s. Really the only piece of legislation that addresses redlining, starts to bring investment back into redline neighborhoods. You get that at least at community development corporations, community gardens, right? So you have this push, right, to say from the ground up, people say, hey, we need to, reinvest in communities, right? We need to heal communities. That we're in a crisis, and the answer is rebuild our communities, right? And you get that a huge push from the top down. But there is a very different push from the top down. It really starts with Nixon. And I want to read this quote. This is from John Ehrlichman in '94, and this is coming from the Nixon White House. And it says, quote, "The Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we could make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." I mean, that's a pretty damning quote for someone who was one of the top advisors of Nixon, right? But this leads into an era, and the key thing I want to point out here is not just, we have broken windows, and the broken windows are real. I mean, that's not there. There is a violence epidemic, and there needs to be something done about it. But then the question is, are we going to invest back into communities? Are we going to do health and healing? Are we going to do all of that too? Or is this all going to be put on the backs of policing, which really is unfair to the police as well, right? And my question would be, why are the windows broken? And we never really answer that question, right? We don't go back and say, actually, windows are broken because of redlining and urban renewal, and that's what broke the windows, right? And so without that conversation, you're not going to get the best answers. And that leads us into where we are today in many cases where, we have the foreclosure crisis, as I mentioned before. You have a massive affordability crisis. Every homeowner or potential homeowner, for example, who may want to build wealth in a homeowner in New York City is now competing with big national and international real estate trusts that are buying up all kinds of property, right? And it's not really, and it's very difficult to compete with because they just have deep pockets and cash, right? And so that becomes, another era of speculation. And I like to foreground that there's this big difference between people who are going to be homeowners and occupy homes and people who are running these big trusts. And that's really what's fueling a lot of the displacement and things like that we see. So, this leads us right up until the era we are today. So I'm going to end it there. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's a lot more to add to this story, and there's a lot of angles of it, and I'm sure people have things to say, but I'd love to hear from the other panelists, and I can obviously answer any quick questions about it as well.
Braden, thank you. It's quite a presentation. It's deep and it's wide-ranging at the same time. And this is just what we're talking about, how events from 300, 400 years ago, travel forth and they affect us today. And this is one of the main points that we're trying to make here. So thank you for that. I guess I have a question for you before we start is, if you were to look at other societies, if you've seen another society someplace else in the world that would act as a blueprint as far as a direction to go in from your research, is there any that you think is out there?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of people doing amazing work, first of all, just even in the US. Mm-hmm. There's folks, we were very proud to say that the exhibit was in Evanston in Illinois for their effort of passing the very first municipal reparations, actually, which they're, I think, doing down payment assistance grants with, and so really addressing the history of homeownership issues. I mean, there's folks that are doing community land trusts and even community investment funds, trying to build wealth really broadly and in innovative ways. There's a whole history of co-ops in New York City, which have provided really great, stable home ownership, which is crucial. And, you know, there needs to be a lot more housing in New York City, obviously, particularly maybe shifting to some of these models even. And then, you know, you certainly have very different, certainly very, very different looking social housing and public housing models around the world that are, you know, far more successful than our very disinvested model. So, you know, I think across the board, I think if the will is there, the solutions are there. But yeah, I think one of the things that we often say is that, you know, if you're not intentionally undoing this history, you're almost certainly repeating it and reproducing it. There really isn't a middle ground or a neutral ground. It's like there's no neutral on a moving train, and that's definitely the case when you look at these solutions. And nobody has a silver bullet, so there isn't really one answer. It's a systems change answer.
I know it's simple. It's just, for me, what I've seen recently is I've got friends, young people, you know, I was very, very lucky in the fact that, you know, 25, 30 years ago, I was able to buy a house. But I really don't see the young people around me now, how they're going to come up with the down payments required to get a house nowadays in New York City. We're looking at having to come up with $300,000-$400,000 just for a down payment.
Right. I mean, if you look at, for example, we've done this before. We've done this before. So if you look at the GI Bill, we created very affordable home ownership opportunities, which we don't have, you know, that was largely suburban, but we don't have to, it could be, you know, for apartment buildings and condo buildings in New York City. But those were, you know, one thing about that value of homes, it has to do with the way real estate is being speculated on in the US. And I mean to say it's being speculated on, but not by homeowners, by other people. And the value of those homes in that era was about 1 times average annual income. The average home was about 1 time average annual income, or median, I mean. Now it's 6 times median income, right? So that's just in general, home ownership is much less affordable than it was.
We've had programs, unlike some people that are, last month we had the neighborhood housing Queens, and they were talking about grant programs for down payments and things like this. So there are people trying to create things, but they're sometimes very hard to navigate. Anyways, if I could keep talking, but I would like to bring in our panelists. It's important. First of all, I'd like to introduce Bishop Mitchel Taylor. Bishop Taylor is the co-founder and CEO of Urban Upbound, and he's the senior pastor at the Center of Hope International Church. And he's lived around Queensbridge houses for all his life. In 1991, he became the senior pastor there, and for over a decade, he's provided a safe place for hundreds of children and its after-school programs, and fed thousands of families. In 2004, he established the East River Development Alliance, which eventually became Urban Upbound, and in founding it, he created a true alliance of religious leaders, government officials, educators, business owners, and residents, all working together to effect neighborhood improvement in the NYCHA campuses, the local ones, Queensbridge, Ravenswood, Astoria, and Woodside. And it includes workforce development, college prep, financial education, counseling, community revitalization. And in 2010, he founded the Urban Upbound Credit Union, which is, well, the conversation we've had now is, with the presentation, is an effort to, I guess, redesign the or redesign the Redline. He's trying to do that. And I'd like to bring him out. And then also what we have is Stacy Andreakakis. Stacy holds a Master of Science in Real Estate Development from Columbia University, Master of Science in Applied Mathematics from the Current Institute of Mathematical Sciences at NYU, and a Bachelor's in Applied Science from George Washington. Her passion for understanding the economic and social dynamics between community and private-public partnerships, drives her application of mathematical modeling and answering questions such as how we can better equip our communities with the tools and resources to be their own advocates. Stacy and Bishop Taylor, please join us.
Thank you, Richard.
Hi, guys. Good. So I would like to see if we could start off with some questions. If you have anything that you'd like to bring up to further the discussion on this important subject.
Well, I want to be the extreme gentleman, and I want to say, Stacy, please go first.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Sure. I have a question that I don't necessarily think is outside the topic of discussion, but maybe runs tangentially next to the topic. Obviously, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 made it unlawful to continue redlining practices. However, gerrymandering continues to be an issue at large when it comes to redefining political districts. And as we know, redefining on the kind of funding that neighborhoods and communities receive in terms of their elected officials who may or may not continue to be elected officials. So, I'm kind of interested to sort of hear about what you have to say in reference to that, Braden, because, we did speak with an elected official last week. Richard, am I correct? Or a few weeks ago, and even he really didn't have an answer in reference to this practice being, I don't know, changed for the better for communities. So, kind of.
Well, it is in the new legislation, the voting rights legislation, and ending gerrymandering, I believe, or reforming gerrymandering. So definitely call your elected official to support that, especially those on the fence. The thing I would say is, residential segregation is essentially what makes gerrymandering possible. Because once you concentrate folks right, you're going to be able to draw boundaries around those neighborhoods, and that's really, those boundaries often, you look at redlining maps, you can often find very many boundaries, not just gerrymandering, but sometimes in many places school districts, different resources that are drawn along those lines. And so it's one of the things that America's segregated landscape facilitates, for sure. That answers your question.
Brandon, I would like to ask a question. I think many people that live in the 4 public housing developments in Northwestern Queens, and possibly the 5 developments that we serve in Far Rockaway, and then the 7 developments we serve in East Harlem. But I think that people are asking, what does the modern day quote unquote GI Bill look, of course, without the GI part, but what does that look like for people today?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that there's going to be multiple pieces, and I think that it's a little bit more. It's going to look like maybe investing in things like co-op ownership, co-op models and ownership through that, and community land trusts. I know I don't know if it's worth getting into, but thinking about, for example, like the project I was going to say community investment, but even things like credit unions and building up wealth. Wealth doesn't always have to happen through home ownership. And you can look at down payment assistance grants. I mean, one of the, as part of the group, the New York Housing Conference, and one of the recommendations was using down payment assistance grants for folks who have been historically victims of redlining, and building wealth with them in home ownership, maybe even bringing in a CLT as a sort of co-buyer and guarantor so people can get credit, but that also as they scale up, they build the equity and then scale up to another, maybe a second time, with the next family doing first-time home buyer, you can continue on. So I do think, especially in markets like New York, that's going to be vital. And yeah, I think, I don't want to say that I have every answer to that. I think that actually we need to kind of come together around analyzing, how all this could work. And I'm just noticing someone in the comments mentioning they're part of a community land trust. And, one thing I'll say, an interesting opportunity perhaps over the coming years is that there are, we've had a couple of years ago now, new rent regulations, or not new, but, they closed a lot of loopholes on the rent regulations in New York. And there were speculative investment trusts and things like that who were buying rent-regulated buildings with the expectation they could use the renovations, things like that, to bump them out of rent regulation. And now they can't do that. And on the one hand, there's calls for, getting rid of them again. That might happen for small landlords, I'm not sure. But then with these bigger buildings and stuff like that, it's the opportunity could be that they sell them into community ownership. And there's a program called Pillars to do that. Yeah, go ahead.
Braden, that was great. You must have been reading my mind. So here's a broader follow-up, and then I'll let you go into it. There's 178,000 units of housing in the NYCHA portfolio, which stands for the New York City Housing Authority. That's spread over 5 boroughs, 343 campuses. Now, NYCHA claims that our capital deficit is about $40 billion over the 178,000 units in order to get those apartments out of disrepair in livable, safe conditions. Now, the question is, there's been several introductions, plans, RAD, which has a private and public partnership. You know about that. Now we have RAD-PAC, which is another variation of that. Now there's the blueprint. But when you think about the $40 billion and you think about all of these different things that have historically been a part of the public housing portfolio, and here we are, decades, families have been lost, children have died because of lead, because of this, because of that. It's just not about stock. It's about, heart and soul, lives and families. Why not give these folks a chance or an opportunity to own that stock? I mean, why haven't we really had serious conversations about, or is that more dangerous than keeping it affordable and rental? My thoughts about that, and our credit union, of course, was built on the fact that my dad said before he died, you'll never be able to make sustainable change unless you own money. And so he said the first message you want to send is that we're not going to wait for people to do it for us. We're going to aggregate people and money and do it for ourselves. So, I mean, theoretically, I would be, an advocate for trying to give people in public housing the largest stock of low-income population the opportunity to build home ownership and wealth in place.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely something that, a model that has to be explored. And I think that, especially when you look at RAD and things like that, and, the redevelopment of lots, parking lots, it's like, how much of that, where is that wealth going? Who's getting access to that? And I definitely think that ownership models, for example, one model in New York City that was successful was Nehemiah Homes, which you may be familiar with. Nehemiah was a home ownership program, affordable home ownership program that built, thousands of homes. Actually, when the first wave of homes that they built, 34% of the homeowners were coming out of public housing.
Right,
so,
and it was in Brooklyn.
Yeah, it was in Brooklyn, but it eventually was all around the city. There was a couple.
Yes, you're right.
And
But
it was led by clergy.
Yep, Reverend Johnny Ray Youngblood, Mike Geegan from the Areas the Areas Foundation. But what was really historic about that? Remember when they bought the big house to Times Square during the? You might have read about it during the Democratic convention. I mean, that was the kickoff of that Nehemiah project with the Industrial Areas Foundation, IAF, with Mike Geegan and those guys, and Reverend Johnny Ray Youngblood.
Yeah.
I have a question, Bishop Taylor. That $40 billion capital deficit that's required for, I'm guessing, capital expenditures, right? Basically.
Yes.
Where does that funding come from? I'm actually not familiar with this. I'd just be interested because from a modeling standpoint, I'd be curious to see how you could actually build in that equity to a financial model like that.
Well, that's interesting, Stacy, and that's like a broader, a longer conversation. But I'll say this: that the housing authority is a very complex situation in that, number one, it's federal, sitting in cities, so it's federally owned land sitting, federally subsidized buildings sitting on city property. Right, and so it's the federal government's responsibility to add the investment and the subsidies that make federal subsidized housing work. And historically, over the last 3.5 decades, there has been a gross disinvestment, not only in New York but across the country, in public housing stock. And so a lot of it has defaulted to cities and states that have said, well, it's not my responsibility, but yes, I guess I have a moral responsibility. So I think that's what the other thing is, that public housing, as Braden said earlier, which originally was made or developed as a result of the slums in New York City exclusively for white families, has historically, when it was built, it was a shiny nickel, and they put bureaucrats and political figures in charge of it, not realizing that eventually, depreciation was set in, and you actually needed someone that knew about running one of the largest housing stocks in the country. And we didn't have that. We, because it was quote unquote public housing, because it was federally subsidized, because there were a lot of, things involved, we didn't have professional housing or rental managers managing this stock. And that is partly to blame for where we are today. We have to say that.
Yeah, one of the things I think about all of these is that what's very important on whatever solution you come up with, governance, and oversight, extremely important in whatever. You can have the most aesthetic name. It could be a community land trust. It could be it's about labels, but if there's not proper governance, there's not proper oversight, it will fail like everything else has failed. So I think that's number one, extremely important. And the other thing, when you're talking about the $40 billion, how much of that money do you think could be reduced by just running an efficient operation? Is that based upon, are they equating in the corruption and the waste that's currently existing within these organizations? Or could that be reduced also, not just by raising more funds, but by cutting costs?
Richard,
let me just answer one question, Stacy. Because I have a PhD in this. That's called a public housing. That's called a public housing degree.
Yeah.
And I got it from Queensbridge University. So first of all, let me just say, Richard, that it is one authority, the New York City Housing Authority. Okay. And so the housing authority itself is responsible for 178,000 units of public housing in New York City, with $40+ billion capital deficit needed in order to bring the apartments back to a livable, safe place for families to dwell. Now, having said that, I would love to live in an apartment that was renovated at the cost of $200,000 per unit. I want to go.
That's true. I was going to say, yeah.
I want to go to that apartment. And you know what? Here's the thing. Now, let me just say this. Guess what?
Mhm.
All the hell that public housing residents had to live in for the last 3 or 4 decades, you should renovate it for $400,000, and it wouldn't be enough to reprobate them, to repay them for all the pain and suffering that folks had to go through all these years in these apartments. But I'm just saying that my point is that we have to be more innovative in rethinking how we use the public money and the public trust to create the infrastructure and the stock to deal with what people have been suffering with for many, many years.
One thing I think also in all these systems, we need to start thinking about transparency and accountability from the ground up. How do communities and residents start to participate and understand in these processes? I know with RAD and with some of these others, there's some community engagement and they're thinking about residents committees and things like that. But I think that it's really about reinvigorate. I mean, we talk about this across, not just in NYCHA, but in neighborhoods, the need for new infrastructure to help plan and drive and create neighborhoods. Most often we say most of the time, right, people feel that the only agency that they have or they can have is through opposition. There's very little that people feel like they have a creative agency in their neighborhood, meaning to create and to get involved in what's going to happen next and bring, how are things going to work. And that infrastructure is really a civic infrastructure, and it connects to the, Economic Development Corporation, and it connects to housing, connects to, community planning and parks and you name it, schools, right? So that infrastructure, I think, needs to be really understood, and I think we have the opportunity to do that now. Not, you can look at, virtual spaces and platforms, but also, I do think that we need real on-the-ground community spaces and hubs where people can go and get involved in this and see how is the money being spent, who's doing it, what is that, how's that working? And I think, one of the things we often talk about in engagement planning is like there's not a lot of trust. It's like shocking. There's not a lot of trust. Look at this whole history. The whole history has been about breaking trust. But I think accountability is even better than trust, because if I can fire you, I'm actually going to trust you more. I prefer to fire you or be able to fire you than just have to take your word for it. And I think that we need those kinds of really small d democracy kind of embedded more. And I think that comes to ownership of wealth, and community ownership and things like that is a crucial piece of democracy in some ways. And then also, the governance systems and how the money is getting spent and who's checking in on it and how.
So Braden, do you think that there could be a solution that perhaps falls into the technological sphere in terms of bringing these communities both virtually together and also together within actual physical hubs, as you just mentioned?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's both. I think you have to, I really do value, the reason we have our exhibit, we do it virtually now, but we love to have it in physical spaces because it gathers people, and people have just different interactions when they're gathering. And they and that's really important to us. High touch, we like to say, not high tech, but high touch. Mm-hmm. Not been a popular phrase during COVID. But yeah, no, I mean, there's definitely, you could see, I mentioned earlier community investment funds, and some people are doing some interesting things with that, and how, you become a shareholder. There's interesting ways that we can help people become shareholders without needing existing money and capital to throw down on things. And it allows us to build wealth altogether, even if you don't have, that's the issue with building wealth is generally you need money first to start. You need a down payment. You need money to buy the stocks or whatever it is. keeps people out of wealth building. So we need to figure out ways to get people in. And then with the community investment, that's really about investing in businesses, investing in the neighborhood, investing, socially, environmentally responsibly together. And that people are doing innovative platforms with that. You've heard of like Robinhood and stuff like that, but people are doing stuff that are more about building community together as well.
I guess my question is more also when it comes to something like that, you're talking about policies that use census data as a means of determining funding for a lot of communities. And census data is super outdated, and also it's highly inaccurate because it doesn't really represent the community at large. So how do we get around that? Because it seems like without an accurate estimation of how many people we do need to serve within communities, then it's sort of like the snake eating its own tail, and it just continues in this really.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm sure that there's 89 more people in New York. I'll go find them. He's trying to get on. But yeah, we can, give me a long weekend. I can get you 89 people. Yeah, so obviously that's a big issue. And that being said, as you're pointing out, flawed as census is, it's definitely our most robust outreach that we do on anything. I've been in other places that are, talking about how do we engage people and reach people in planning. Most of the time you hear from the same 5 people. No offense, but you hear the same, squeaky wheels, right, about different issues, but you don't hear from the whole community, and that actually is really different. I'll give you an example of this. We were working with some folks in LA, and they were coming out with a lot of people opposing the siting of supportive housing for formerly homeless folks. And they were getting a lot of pushback, and people assumed, and in the neighborhoods they were putting in, were particularly the whiter, wealthier neighborhoods. And they assumed, these neighborhoods fight that, and they did, and particularly, older, whiter residents and women who are afraid. And so they actually commissioned a polling company to do a poll of the neighborhood. It was scientifically, just poll, and found that and they just polled older white women who were supposedly the ones that were the biggest against the siting, and found that 75 or 80% were for it. And
I
so,
think one thing that,
but then who's showing up to the meetings is not the 75, 80%. So, this is what I'm talking about with small d democracy. It's like that's what's going on.
I think that one thing, I happen to have been on the local community board for a number of years, and I think that it's getting better. Okay, the new borough president has definitely brought it much farther along in terms of diversity, and both age-wise, ethnically, in different ways. So it's much better and much more reflective of the society, but it's still not there yet. And it may be a thought at some point down the road to actually elect them, because right now everybody's appointed by another politician. So sometimes you may think that they're representing not the community, but the politicians themselves. And like anything else, you can have, like they say, the best form of government is a benevolent dictatorship. In this case, if we have a good borough president, we're going to have a good community board. But then if we get somebody like our last administration in there, that all gets reversed. So, I hope that kind of thing, if you're talking about small d democracy, bringing it down to that level, to the local block level, I think makes a lot of sense too.
I think it's nationally a big thing. It's actually, we're talking about this with the infrastructure bill, and this is like community infrastructure that's missing. Not only in redline neighborhoods and in cities, but in Main Street, America, actually.
Yeah.
Main streets in redline neighborhoods and main streets in small towns that need that need a different type of investment to come in that's actually going to reach the people with our, which isn't happening in either case.
One other question. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
One other question. There was an example, of course, in the 2000s, I think, with Clinton, when they started to loosen up requirements for home ownership. And there was a famous quote from our previous mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, who actually said that the reason why we had the 2008 pseudo-depression or major recession was because of the removal of redlining. So first of all, I'd like you to comment on that comment of his. And also, if we do go into a situation where we start to loosen up the restrictions, how do we avoid, though, going into a similar situation where predatory lenders come in there and take advantage of the situation so that and everything gets blown up again, which could easily happen?
Yeah. Well, if you look at what happened prior to 2008, what he's referring to is the Community Reinvestment Act and requiring banks to give mortgages to their full district, which includes in redlined areas. And then banks said, there's nobody qualifies, and so therefore, we're going to create subprime. But that's not actually what happened. Mm-hmm. Well, more than half of the institutions that were involved in subprime mortgages were not regulated by CRA. So explain that. They weren't CRA banks. They were, these mortgage companies, Quicken and Rocket Mortgage, similar. I don't even know if they were or not. I don't mean to say them, but other people too, along with the banks. But I mean, and one thing we know is there were many home buyers, particularly Black home buyers, who would have qualified for regular mortgages who got targeted for subprime. And the subprime mortgage crisis a lot was taking place in redline neighborhoods. So there is a link, but the link is the predatory systems. I mean, if you go back even to redlining doesn't mean, no, there's no systems there for mortgages. What happens is predatory systems fill the hole that the federal government created. And people need loans, so here come loan sharks, right? So, and that becomes, kind of the legacy. Now, when the last thing I'll say, looking forward, I think that this is why you need to, when you talk about people who've been at the front end of redlining, right? There's a lot of systems that you have to heal. You can't just say, okay, get this. Usually, most of the systems people are exposed to are predatory, whether that's payday lending or that's, the way the banking works. I mean, look at this. I believe banks in general during COVID crisis made $5 billion in New York City off overdraft fees. Okay? So it's a lot of money being pulled out of people who really don't have it. Anyway, so I do think that part of it's actually just like really we need to get a handle on the predatory things that are going on. And then, I think that this model, for example, with down payment assistance and bringing in maybe a community land trust, sort of acting as a guarantor, co-buyer, right? Who's able to work with the family, secure the land, and then, they build equity, but maybe it's, at a more affordable rate so that the next time, or there's a model in there where they build wealth, but then the next home buyer of that home is going to remain affordable for the next family. So I think that you can create the models, but I agree. You can't just say cut people big checks and not expect predatory people to come in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're running out of time now, but what I'd like to do is if Stacy and Bishop, if you have one more short question you can come up with and to ask, and then we can go.
Yeah, I might have questions for that next, but okay.
Okay, good. Well, please do. Stacy?
Well, no, I was just going to sort of discuss the valuation process when we were talking about the 6 times median income versus the 1 times median income, and the National Association of Realtors, who sort of have a very heavy lock on the valuation process across the country. You know, the valuation process of homes, especially within the residential market, is an extremely flawed system, and it really hasn't been changed, which in part is due to the heavy lobbying on behalf of the National Realtors Association. So one of the things that, you know, should be taken into consideration, and I'd love to hear your opinion about this, but from my perspective, as someone who's seen the numbers on this and done evaluations way more times than I would care to admit, you know, how do we really start to combat that when there is such a heavy lobbying group behind the National Realtors Association, so that people can not only have the down payments for the homes that they would like to buy, but also have fair housing prices?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a Gordian knot a little bit, because obviously, right, on the one hand, I you know, you don't want to say, oh, let's limit the wealth building of one group of people, and you know, and then if you have more money, you get to play on the market, and you know, that's a whole nother question. I do think, though, that the way the system works now is essentially it's cut out most people, certainly in our market, most people. So we need affordable home ownership options, but and you know, even an affordable home ownership option, you're going to build wealth. In terms of valuation, yeah, I mean, that's something you might know more about than I do. It sounds like you do know a lot more. What to do about it? I think that we have to open that whole can of worms up. The way that land value gets assessed, where you know, to your point about fair housing, there's an example in Chicago where a black woman, put her house up, had her house assessed, and she found that it was assessed for, I guess, the same price she had bought it for a few years before, and then she removed herself from the assessment process, took down all the pictures of her, and had another assessor come in who evaluated it for $80,000 more. Right? He doesn't know it has a black homeowner. I mean, that's a real thing that goes on, and apparently there's something like $20 billion in black wealth that's associated with just mismatched home assessments. There's also the financialization of the whole thing, and all of the players from banks who are making all this money off of mortgages. You know, one thing about wealth building home ownership, most of the wealth goes to the banks. Okay. And you know, and then the real estate, you know, brokers, all this. So there's this huge industry built on extracting a lot of wealth from home ownership. That it's a systemic problem. That's why we have these systemic problems.
And Bishop?
No, I think that, you know, we Braden covered, you know, a lot of the things that, you know, in his presentation that was, you know, I think a lot of people think about all the time, and, you know, it's really been, you know, a compounded problem over time, and trying to unwind the red line is, you know, an ongoing effort, I think, and I certainly want to support that. I really get very incensed when I hear the history recited again and again and again as it has retarded, you know, black and brown wealth historically. And so there's much more to be said about that. I hope that we can, I'd love to get, have further conversation with you, Braden. I'll get your information so we can continue to talk. And, but no, thank you so much, Richard.
We can always bring the exhibit to Astoria sometime soon, you know.
Awesome.
Yeah, actually, when you get the physical presentation up, maybe we can find a place to actually put it up around on the waterfront.
Yeah, we do. When we bring it places, also we do a process of localizing history and getting stories and stuff like that. So if people have local histories to add, that we can add them in.
Yeah, you know, it's important that the people that live here, they're living in the present. They don't know what's going on in the past, and it's real important to establish those roots in order to grow, you know. So that's one of the goals of what we're trying to do. So thank you so much, Braden. That's a great presentation. And a lot to think about. And listen, if anybody has any comments or anything that they weren't able to ask, you can email us at info@oana-ny.org, and we'll get you back an answer. Okay. So also stick around. Our next part of our program.
And here is our next part of our program. That was a great presentation. Everybody did a great job. It was really enlightening and important. And further to that, to make any updates on what was said or discuss some new subjects, we have two of the panelists coming now that were already introduced. So could we bring in Bishop Mitchel Taylor, okay, and Braden Crooks? And then I would also like to invite a new participant. He's actually, it's Memo Salazar, who's a co-chair of the Western Queens Community Land Trust, founded in 2020 to help make land affordable for New Yorkers again. He's a longtime president of Sunnyside and also runs the Sunnyside CSA. Though his day job is as a filmmaker, he currently works with Elmo and Big Bird on Sesame Street as a supervising producer. So thanks everybody for coming. It was really, none of you seem to have aged in 2 years. That's good. I like the concept of this, you know. We're sorry that Stacy couldn't make it, but she had had some conflicts. But we'd like to start here with each of you, if you could take a second, now that you've actually seen again, and looks like Bishop is driving again. Bravo. Okay, good. It's continuity. I like it. So if you have any comments to make on what just happened, and then we can go into some other discussions on other questions that may be appropriate. I'd like to start with Braden, see what he's been doing in the last 2 years quickly, and any updates on what was previously discussed.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was pretty comprehensive, and it was interesting to rewatch some of that. I didn't catch quite all of it, but because I don't always like to hear my voice. But you know, for the past couple of years, I was actually just down in DC. We had the exhibit at the National Black Caucus annual legislative conference, and speaking to a handful of folks there, you know, one of the things that was touched on at the end that I actually know, you know, a bit more about now, it's the appraisal bias issue. A huge amount of data has come out. Dr. Andrew Perry did a study of that out of Brookings about appraisal bias and several of the other ways that Black-owned property is being and other folks of color are being systematically devalued in the United States, and it's a huge contributor to the wealth gap. The other piece I think that is becoming more and more acute now is kind of the pairing, I think, on the one hand of locking in affordability for existing residents. I think that we have a big issue around rental inflation right now, and especially as it relates to rent regulated units, where we see those numbers going way up. And then at the same time that we need to really act on preservation of affordability, we do need to build more housing. So that the crisis around the housing shortage has become really acute around the country, and we're seeing movement on that, particularly on in places not just in the city, but in wider, wealthier areas that surround New York City. As you may know, the governor and some of the legislators this past year really tried to push for some comprehensive changes, allowing for new development, particularly around transit and in places like Long Island, where, you know, you just have parking lots. And, you know, there's just, and I think the New York City area is in a deficit of hundreds of thousands of housing units compared to how many jobs have increased over the same period. And that's largely because of exclusionary zoning. And one of the things that we see through this history is at least the mental connection between preserving exclusivity and preserving property values. And still today in New York, when this whole proposal was trying to push through, you saw very similar arguments coming from folks who, you know, we don't want those people, you know, and affordable housing becomes a sort of uh, dog whistle for certain people, and we saw that defeated actually. So that did not happen. Those changes that would have sort of began the accelerating of new and affordable housing, which we desperately need. I would say, and I'm really glad we have someone from a CLT. I would love to see projects like that, new and affordable housing, being paired with projects like CLTs, housing cooperatives, you know, alternative models that help preserve affordability and build wealth and are more accessible to folks who, you know, have been cut out for a very long time. The last thing that I would add would be, you know, I was just talking with folks in California who are working on a much larger scale down payment assistance and things like that for folks who've been affected by redlining and for first generation home buyers. So I'm very excited about that. But these things kind of need to come together, and we need to come at it from a bunch of different sides. But so I'll just end there.
Great, thank you. Bishop, could you tell us a little bit about what's happened in the 2 years since, particularly since you were discussing a lot of NYCHA issues at that point. So where do we stand at this point? The one thing I do know is the $40 billion we were talking about 2 years ago is a distant memory.
It never happened.
And not only that, I mean, now it's expanded. The deficit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I thought you were referring to the $80 billion that Chuck Schumer was presenting as a bill to be passed for public housing nationally, of which New York would have gotten $40 billion to deal with the crumbling infrastructure that exists in the NYCHA portfolio, which is approximately 170,000 units of housing spread out over 5 boroughs in New York City, 450,000 leaseholders. And of course, the amount of people that probably live in the developments are much more than the number of leaseholders that are recorded. But I guess what has happened over 2 years, a whole lot. You know, we were in the middle of COVID, and of course, we were accommodating folks that were in shelter in individual living in order to mitigate the spread of COVID. And so a lot of the hotels, particularly because Long Island City had a large concentration of hotels, a lot of those hotels were commandeered, and folks that were living in a dormitorial situation in shelters were now put into single rooms. And so we rolled out of that into the migrant crises. And so, of course, Long Island City again, having this large room capacity. I guess the hotel owners love it, because when do you ever get a hotel that's 100% occupied every single week, every month, right? So it's like a windfall. Like every hotel operator should be giving money to the Western Queens Land Trust. But anyway, yeah. So I mean, I think that the problem of housing. I just highlighted those two things, a double whammy back to back. and we still have not increased housing stock. And then beyond that, in between the last 2 years, we've been seeing the publication of studio apartments, 1-bedroom apartments. I think the average 1-bedroom apartment now is what, like $4,000? I mean, it's unbelievable. If a person makes $50,000 a year and they bring home, I don't know what that is, someone smarter than me can do the calculations, but it certainly does not support $4,000 a month rent in a 1-bedroom, and most families, can't live in a 1-bedroom. So, I mean, and even the affordable housing that is available is a conundrum, because if you have a father and a mother, if you happen to have 2 people working, and they make over a certain amount for the Housing Connect property, the property that they apply for is almost market rate, through the affordable housing portals. And so people are in a real conundrum. And then the problem with that is, the cost of living has increased exponentially, because of many factors that, I'm sure our other guests will be able to, highlight, or will highlight rather. But so the cost of living has gone up. I was talking to a mother yesterday. She said, Bishop, a gallon of milk is $5 and a loaf of bread is $4. That's 2 items, $9. I mean, so I think that a lot has happened over the last 2 years. I mean, of course, I can go on and on and on about what has happened over the last 2 years, but I want to give someone else a chance to express some of the other things. But yeah, a lot has happened, Richard. I mean, and at Urban Upbound particularly, we have opened our doors to our immigrant brothers and sisters that need, assistance with, ESL, with, trying to figure out, what to do while you can't work. I mean, there's a whole lot going on here. You know what I mean? We have jobs, but we can't place them in jobs. We have I-10s, but we can't issue them. I mean, so there's a lot going on. Yeah. There's a lot going on.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Yep. Memo, you're new to this ensemble, so we all welcome you, and we'd certainly like to hear your perspective. For you, this is your introduction. You don't have to go back 2 years ago.
Right. Well, thank you. No, I mean, I caught the second half of the pre-recording, and it was really fascinating to hear everyone sort of weigh in on the history, tying it into present day and so on. I mean, I think everyone's in agreement that, New York City becomes less and less affordable to the average person. All of that, it's not a very controversial point of view, right? We all see it happen every single day. And then the question is, so why is it happening is sort of debatable, right? Different people have different points of view. And also, what do we do about it? So first of all, from the CLT perspective, I became part of this group that eventually started a CLT and so on, mostly because, like anybody else, I didn't grow up in Queens, but I've been here for a good chunk of my life. It's my home. I love this place dearly. And I just kept seeing, me being like, when am I ever going to afford anything around here, like to buy a home? And B, and I'm one of the luckier ones. Like, I have an okay job. Like, there's a lot of people that are much worse, and how are they ever going to afford anything? And seeing that become a harder and harder dream, and not knowing what to do about it. When I first discovered the idea of CLTs, I realized it was like the first practical solution I had ever heard to solving this problem. I think in a perfect world, the city would be solving this problem, right? You'd have better public housing. You'd have great programs like Mitchel and things like that the city would proactively be doing that. But unfortunately, our city is not doing that. And so then it becomes things like CLTs that offer a secondary solution, even though, I'm not a government agency. The CLT is a nonprofit. All CLTs are nonprofits. And so, but it's like in this world, it's sort of the best solution that I've seen. And what I love about CLTs is that they are structured in a way that communities maintain the control. They literally put the control of the land back into the hands of the people that live there, and making us really stewards of this land, which is what, this land way before anybody from Europe was here was being stewarded by people that lived on this land, passed on generation to generation. We're really trying to just go back to that basic concept, that this land isn't about making money. It's about living and providing life for others. And when we are gone from this planet, hopefully we can pass that baton to the next generation, and they can pass it on to their kids and so on. And that's really all, in a very fundamental sense, that's what the CLT is really trying to achieve. The way they achieve that, or try to achieve that, is through what we call a tripartite system of community ownership. And so basically what that means is the Western Queens CLT is here to try to help the community get land, whether it's a house, a building, a community center, a park, a garden, whatever it is. The CLT doesn't run anything. The CLT holds a deed to that land, and in that deed is locked in permanent affordability. We're sort of like the moral conscience of that piece of land. Whatever group the CLT is working with that's on that land is the ones that are in charge of like running the actual either building or park or whatever it may be. So let's say, for example, here's an example, a group of tenants have a really bad landlord. The landlord's been really negligent. They have mold, they have all sorts of issues, and the landlord's not doing anything. The tenants start to organize and try to fight back. They could partner with a CLT to try to buy that building from the landlord. The CLT can provide expertise and funding streams that the tenants on their own wouldn't know about or know how to even start the process. The CLT and the tenants work together. They, negotiate with a landlord who eventually chooses to sell them that building, hopefully at a decent, lower than market price, but who knows? But regardless, they take the responsibility of the rehab and all of the things the landlord has been doing off of his or her hands. And now the CLT has to work with the tenants. The tenants now become the group that runs/owns that building, but they don't own the land under the building. So it's this weird sort of thing where we're dividing the property, the building itself, from the land that's under it. What that pretty much means in reality is that the tenants, for all intents and purposes, that's their home. They run it. The CLT doesn't tell them what to do. It's their home. But the tenants can't sell that building and make a big chunk of profit in 10 years, 20 years, or 40 years. They're locked into an affordable contract with the community that the CLT is sort of stewarding, so that if in 40 years your kids are like, you know what, I don't want to live here, let's just make a ton of money because this neighborhood has gotten more and more expensive, they're unable to do that. They're prevented, and they have to pass on that same affordability to the next generation, to whoever they sell it to. So it's a limited equity that they're able to build, but they're protected by, they have a CLT there to protect them on the flip side of that. So they're not viewing land and houses as like a way to make a ton of money. It's not like a monopoly board. It's like the opposite of that. And that's basically what the CLT is there to do. We're just here to help the community. And by the community, that can mean anybody. It could be a religious group. It could be an ethnic group. It could just be a bunch of neighbors. We're just here to work with the neighborhood. In fact, the example that I just gave you about the tenants buying the building is happening right now in East New York. The East New York CLT is about to sign a deal with a landlord just like that, who, through the activism of those tenants who were just tired of living in these really bad conditions, reached out to that CLT. The CLT was able to get a little money to hire a consultant to get the fundraising done, and they got the money, and they're going to sign sometime in November. And then will become the process of rehabbing the building and all of that stuff. It's not an easy road, and I don't want to make anybody think that CLTs have a magic wand solution. New York City is really expensive, even beyond the cost of land. The cost of build out and rehab and labor is really high. And the good side of that is that we have really great labor unions and people get paid well. But the hard part of that is it costs a lot of money. You can't you can't kind of skirt around that. And so it's a real challenge for CLTs, but little by little, the El Barrio CLT got a few buildings from the city about a year ago, and they are in the process of rehabbing those. This land is our land. Was fighting Robert Moses in the 60s to fight a highway. That led to the Cooper Square CLT in the 90s, and now they have 23 properties on the Lower East Side at deeply, deeply affordable rent prices. So it isn't just fairy tale, it is happening, but in New York City, it's really, really hard because everything's really, really expensive. And so we've only been around a couple years, but that's our mission here in Western Queens, is to help the community find ways of doing that. Whether it's our biggest project is the Department of Ed building in Long Island City, where Amazon was going to build their headquarters. We're trying to keep that a public building and turn it into a community hub for food vendors and artists of all walks of life. We have a huge project. We got a funding to create a proposal. We worked with an architect. We have a proposal on paper that we are now in the midst of trying to get the city to look at and consider. But beyond that project, we are open to working with anyone in Western Queens that has the need and the passion and the idea to kind of make it forward, whether it's housing, whether it's community space, whatever type of land. So that's like the really fast version of CLTs. CLTs were born out of redlining, which is an interesting history to tie it back to your project. In 1963, Slater King, cousin of Martin Luther King, and the SNCC started the first CLT in Georgia. It was called New Communities, and they were helping Black sharecroppers farm. Basically, they had lost their homes and jobs for registering to vote, and they had a really tough time with, it was pure 100% non-hidden racism that was like fighting them all the way. And they actually ended up folding in 1985 because they had applied for loans from the Farmers Home Administration, the federal Farmers Home Administration, and those loans were regularly denied or delayed. Whereas for white farmers, they would come through, and so they had a much harder time of staying afloat whenever there was a drought or storm. And finally, in 1985, they folded, and so that was like a very direct example of this racism that's embedded in redlining with these farmers. But they kicked off the CLT movement in America, and it's been growing ever since. And so that's the sort of silver cloud. And so that's how we're here today. If that
okay,
helps.
well, thank you so much for that explanation. I know a lot of people hear the term, but they don't really know what's behind it. So that's great. I'd like to ask a few questions. Just throw them out there. Number one, there is an argument or something, or different philosophies on making housing more affordable. One is based upon increasing regulation, and the other is based upon increasing supply. One is using classic capitalism, and one is using a more socialist approach. I'd like to get your opinions on these and what you think is the most effective way to go. I ask this because I spent the last 20 years on a zoning committee and zoning board, and it's a constant. When new projects come up, it's a constant issue that we have to deal with. How do we, maintain integrity of the neighborhood, but also increase housing, so that there's more supply than demand? And this is our major issue that we're dealing with all the time. So I'd love to get your opinions on this. Braden?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Well, housing is definitely, the majority of housing is in a market. So building new housing, we know that building more housing reduces housing costs in a given market. And I know that there's some new data out there that shows that. I'm sorry. And that compares similar sized Midwestern cities, units per person built, and the cities that built the most units per person over the past 10 years, maybe 20 years, have actually seen their rents fall relative to inflation, whereas the cities that built much fewer units per person saw the rents go significantly higher. So that's a big issue. But I would also add that there's other factors at play, particularly in a city like New York: speculation, you know, large real estate players that play the market here, and that is sort of pouring gasoline on the fire. So I'm a believer that we kind of need to do both. We need new housing and we need sort of long-term affordability. One thing that I would just add about this is that the median cost of a home has gone up is 6 times inflation in America. It's
In
because
America or in New York City?
New
So
York
New York
City is
City.
higher. New York City's higher. I don't. That's the general America. I actually don't know America, but so that's a huge amount. It means that housing was much more affordable, and now it's much less affordable. We've relied on property values to build wealth for the middle class, for better or worse. And so now, sorry, just someone trying to call me. So now we have this huge affordability crisis. One thing I just want to point out, let's say that housing values had gone just at the same rate as inflation. Mortgages are very expensive, and one of the things that's changed in 2 years is interest rates. So interest rates have gone up substantially. It's so much more expensive now to get a mortgage for the same home than it was 2 years ago. But the interest rates fluctuate, but a mortgage will cost between 2 and 3 times the cost of your home. Okay, so in a 30-year mortgage, you need to double or triple the value of your home to break even. And we call that the number one wealth building tool. Okay, it's like a very expensive savings account. And although it is the number one way people build equity, it's just because they spend so much of their income on it. That's why. And it's definitely better than renting. With renting, you don't get, you get zero, right? So here you're getting a half or a third of the money you're spending. But one of the things I just want to point out is that if housing values hadn't gone up at 6 times inflation, they just went up in inflation, the cost of the mortgages would be so much less over the life of the mortgage. At the end of the day, back of the napkin math, this is my back of the napkin math, okay? At the end of the day, you end up with more money. You end up with more wealth if housing values hadn't gone up so much, the average homeowner, because you could just take the money you're saving on a mortgage and put it into a savings account and end up with a huge chunk of money at the end of 30 years that you don't get because we're piling it into housing. So I'm a big believer in saying maybe we don't necessarily need to look at housing as our number one wealth building tool, and pair affordability, maximize for affordability, and then pair that with other wealth building opportunities. That folks can have: community investment funds, community wealth trusts, public banking, et cetera, et cetera. It would be a much more stable way to build wealth for families, I think, and preserve affordability and preserve the availability of home ownership for many more families.
Well, that's interesting. For me, I'm a musician by trade, so I have very little coming in terms of Social Security and stuff. And my house is my retirement. And I would
for many people,
I would be homeless without it. So, anyways, but society doesn't give me anything else beyond that. So, anyways, Bishop, comments?
I mean, everything that everyone said thus far is, their different strategies to, create affordability, to create opportunity. And I don't think there's a wrong way. I think that they're just different ways. And I think at the end of all those paths, we want to accomplish a couple of things. And I think that, just going back to the housing and the wealth building note, it's an interesting analogy that Braden gave about, the cost of a mortgage. He's absolutely right. If you buy a home, if you're calculating or amortizing it over 30 years, you're going to at least double the cost of the house. At least you're going to pay, so finding, why that has become one of the single pathways to build wealth, you know, I guess because there's, you know, other limited opportunities. Yes, I agree with Braden. Maybe we put a lot of emphasis there, and maybe there should be, you know, less emphasis there and more emphasis on savings, you know, wealth building and saving, you know, because you're not spending 60 to 70% on your rent, you know. It's
And
not, you
renting.
know, Richard, I'm sorry to say it. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Braden.
No,
Huh?
well, I mean, sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you know, there's just no easy answers to this, and
No,
you know,
there
we'll be
isn't.
talking about, yeah,
I mean, renting
you know, and
is
that's why I think
definitely worse, you know, than that in terms of the wealth. You're not going to build any wealth when you're doing it through rent. And I think, and I also want to say that I really believe that home ownership is a very important thing for every household, or that every household has a place. You know, it doesn't have to be in the traditional home ownership model. That is home. That is somewhere to the point that Memo meant, right? Steward that's secure for a family. You know, that someone can't just pull the rug out from under you one day. And I think that everybody needs
You have
that.
no idea how important that is. Yep.
Yeah, that's critical to human beings.
Mhm.
And believe it or not, having a home predates the 30-year mortgage. And it predates the whole system that we have now. So it's going to last a long time afterward too. So we can have many models for home and for security and real anchoring in home as well. So
That would be an interesting study to look over the last 1,000 years and exactly what tools were used to finance the purchase of a home. You know, I would be interested to. That could be, there could be tools in the past going back 500 years that may apply now. You don't know. So, Memo, is there your comment on that? Memo,
Sure.
excuse
Yeah.
me. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, I mean, so I guess there's like, on one hand, there's like the philosophical argument, and then there's like the pragmatic argument. And on the philosophical side, you're always gonna have people who are very much like 100% dyed-in-the-wool socialist, like any private property is just wrong to begin with. And on the other hand, you've got like free market loving capitalists who like the idea of socialized anything is like an insult to them, right? And so you can battle that philosophy out. I mean, and in that, like forget my personal, where I fall under that radar. Looking at it pragmatically, I want to challenge the idea that that when you build more houses, that, I mean, I know on paper that's true, right? Or it seems true. However, here in New York City, in 1940, you had 3 1/3 people per housing unit. And now in 2023, that's down to 2 1/3. So it went from 3.3 to 2.3 since 1940. So we actually have more homes now per person in New York City than we have ever had since 1940, since we started tracking this stuff, which completely flies against the idea that what we need to do is build more housing. The problem is, I think in a very fair and true market, that might be true. But as you know, our city is very much controlled by revenue and other factors that create artificial ups and downs, which is why we've outpaced the inflation by 6 times. So, like, for example, the vacancy rate for homes that are priced at 2,300 or higher is like 13%. So whereas like the vacancy for like a home, by home I mean like an apartment, like 1,500 or lower is like 1%. So there's a lot of warehousing and a lot of empty homes. So the numbers of just building more when those homes just stay empty because people don't want to lower their prices and they would rather just sit on something for years because the developers have so much money that they can afford to like sit on something for years until somebody rich enough to pay it will pay it, is completely changing the sort of logic of like build more homes. So I don't buy that argument not because in theory it's right or wrong, but because the reality is that New York City is not reflecting that sort of logic, and the numbers back that up. And so I'm not saying that CLTs are the only way to do things. I'm like Bishop Taylor. I'm like, whatever way gets you there, I'm good with. But I don't think that just supporting more development is going to get us there, because unfortunately, the development that happens almost all the time around here favors luxury and market rate houses with a tiny sort of like bone thrown towards the affordability people. And it's just outgrowth, right? You get like a couple of truly affordable apartments and hundreds of really expensive ones, and that just makes all the other market around it jacked up because those homes are higher. And it's like this, and that's how we got to the point that Braden is talking about.
One argument that comes up about that, though, I know that people reference back to the 2 years ago to COVID, and that was a situation where, because of so many people moving out of the city, the supply and demand changed, not because of more apartments being built, but because of less renters. And there was a significant drop in rents at that point, and there was a significant free months to move in. So I think that there is, in a lot of cases, I have to look at that and say there is an effect for supply and demand. It's hard to deny it when it happened right there just 2 years ago. So, what we'd have to do is dig down into it and see what made that unique from what you're talking about, with something that's controlled by, behemoth organizations, and find that sweet spot. This is what we're looking for. It's the same sweet spot we're looking for in the zoning board between, do we change the character of a neighborhood in Queens, which is a bunch of 2-family buildings, for somebody that wants to come in and build an 8-story building or a 20-story building or something like that. We're constantly fighting that.
A couple of things I want to add to this. One is that I'm really curious about the way that we measure these things, because household size in New York City from the first half of the 20th century to now has gone down by more than half. So it's been like close to 5 people a household, to around between 2 and 3 on average. So that is what is filling the units. So we're not a lot less efficient in that sense with our use of space, for better or worse. I mean, you had a lot of very crowded tenements as well that it's a significant overcrowding. And then we're also able to show in the New York market, for example, with New Rochelle, you may know, has built a tremendous amount of new housing. It's mostly luxury housing. But New Rochelle, compared to other parts of Westchester County, has, over this period of the explosive growth that they rezoned, seen the rents stabilize and even decline, whereas other parts of Westchester County have still continued to go up. So that's within the same market. Now, the other thing that I want to add, however, sort of at the other angel, or on the other shoulder, is to say that there was a really interesting Curbed article about the manipulation of rents vis-a-vis holding vacant units, and particularly in the wake of COVID, a lot, to Richard's point, a lot of folks left. There was not many people moving within the city or moving to the city, and for that reason, landlords were having a lot of trouble filling units. When the Curbed asked the question, did people really come back? Because they were looking at this algorithmic model that landlords were using, big corporate landlords, that was sort of helping them set rents. And part of what they were coaching those folks to do was to hold units vacant in order to create artificial scarcity. So it's the same mechanism, right? Which is, how many units do we have versus how many people are there looking for them? But it's artificially manipulating the market. So I definitely think that we need, and I don't know what the follow-up on that article was. It came out, I can look it up and maybe send it out. It was a year or two ago, but and I don't know if they've done more research into it or not, or what came of it. But the manipulation of the market is definitely something that especially the bigger actors are involved in, or it seems that way. So I definitely think that's true. And that being said, I think that you know, we can do housing preservation, affordability preservation, and I'm a, you know, I've been part of helping create land trusts. Big fan of. I think that everything should go in a land trust at some point, including new development. So anyway, I just want to say that, but that's what we know about.
Yeah, I
Well,
mean, I agree.
no,
I sorry, didn't mean to
go
jump
ahead.
in.
No, go ahead.
I mean,
Except it is getting to be 9 o'clock now, so
right.
it's been going since 6:30. So this
I,
is
I,
a bit
people
of a
want to
marathon.
sleep. I understand. Yeah, no, I
What-
mean, I agree with Braden, and like, it's true. Like, I was going to say the same thing to your point. Is like, yes, COVID showed a very clear example of supply and demand, but look at how quickly the rents jump right back up to pre-COVID levels. And no, those people didn't all just end up moving back. The city's population stayed down. So, like you said, there was some manipulation. The only thing I wanted to add was that like the only difference between us and pretty much the rest of the country is that we have a very limited space. Like we can't keep expanding. There's like no space to build too much more. So that's where like it gets a little trickier, right? And that's where like Richard, like I agree with you. I want to preserve the beautiful sense of Queens community, but at some point people are going to point out the obvious that the only way to build is up and not out. And so it's a tricky thing. I'm not saying I have the answers, but New York is very unique.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. But you know, I think that people want to eat dinner and enjoy. But I think I'd like to continue this conversation. Memo, Braden, you know, Braden, I'd like to talk to you about possibly bringing your presentation physically here to we can maybe find a venue to do it in here. And you know, we'd like to maybe all meet and continue these discussions. I think they're very important. And what's important is that we get people with different points of views. And I don't want a situation where it's a bunch of people yelling at each other instead of listening to each other. I'm too used to the people yelling in both directions and not hearing a thing. And what we're here to do is to somehow keep our ears open and see if there's a way to come up with actual solutions. You know, so with that, I know that I think Bishop had to head off to. I'm sure he's very busy. He's had a long day, but we'd like to thank him for being with us. We'd also like to thank our councilperson, Tiffany Caban, who joined us earlier. Braden, thank you so much for the presentation. And Memo, it's great to meet you finally. We've talked on the phone a few times, and let's hope that we continue these conversations. So this is the Old Astoria Neighborhood Association. I also want to thank Victor, our host. Victor, thank you so much for all you do. And we will see each other next month, to be determined at this point. We're not sure of a date and time. We were late this month because of the Jewish holidays. We wanted to wait, but we will talk soon and look forward to a brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.